This is Growth Guide, a podcast exploring the depths of curiosity, questioning everything in the name of growth. I'm your host, Brian D'Alessandro.
Today we're embarking on a journey into the heart of our fears and discovering the paths that lead us out of the shadows. My guest is Gareth Higgins, a writer from Belfast who grew up during Northern Ireland Troubles. Gareth is a masterful storyteller, a peace activist, and a guide who walks us through the landscape of our fears, not by bypassing them, but by understanding their origins and confronting their power over us. His book is a beacon for those seeking to find peace in tumultuous times, offering strategies rooted in personal narrative, social history, and profound empathy. In How Not to Be Afraid, Higgins delves into the nature of fear itself, the way it shapes our lives, societies, and the stories we tell ourselves. So whether you're grappling with personal anxieties and stress or the collective unease of our time, today's conversation promises to shine a light on the paths through the darkness. Stay with us as we uncover the insights and strategies that Gareth offers, exploring how we can navigate these complexities of fear and perhaps find ourselves stepping into a space of greater courage, compassion, and connection. Let's get to it. Welcome, Gareth.
Thanks, Brian. Glad to be here.
Yeah, great to have you here. I recently finished reading your book, How Not to Be Afraid, and it's really packed with a lot of wisdom and challenging topics. It was interesting. It got me thinking about the title and the nature of it. And at one point you say that you had a working title of Seeing in the Dark. I'm curious about what your journey on finding the title was itself. Then we can get into the contents of the book.
Yeah, it's nice to be reminded of that. I'd forgotten that was the working title. It was inspired a lot by Rebecca Solnit's book, Hope in the Dark, which is a book about seeing things from the perspective of the good that's always going on. And the word dark there is a reference to something that Virginia Woolf wrote in 1915. The war that would become known as the First World War had just broken out the previous year. He said something like, the future is dark, but she didn't mean that the future is bad. She just meant we can't see it. And aside from the racist connotations of using the word dark to mean bad, which is something I think a lot more people are becoming conscious of, I try to be careful to say things like bleak or depressing or scary to refer to bad things. The point is that you can't see the future. No one's ever been able to see the future. And so what would you like to live in the light of? Would you like to live in the light of the stories of courage, creativity, and community that have gone before us? Or do you want to unconsciously mirror the behavior of people who were obsessed with fear and who acted violently, aggressively toward others or themselves as a result of their? In the end, we dropped that title for the publisher had already published a book by somebody else about something else. I have a book called Praying his name is Dan Snyder, and that's a book about spiritual practices in timeless fear and uncertainty. So in the end, How Not to Be Afraid was the better title. And as you've already referred to, the title of How Not to Be Afraid is almost a joke. It's almost a little trick there, because it's not how to stop feeling fear, because first of all, that's impossible. And secondly, it would be dangerous. We need to have a healthy dose of fear in our lives. Otherwise, we would walk off cliffs all the time, or we would never put our seatbelt on. And that's when fear is wisdom, and it's how the brain has evolved to take care of us, to show us that there are risks in life and that we can make informed judgments about which risks to take and which ones not to take. But then there's all this unnecessary fear, and fear that's not inevitable, and fear that could actually just be damaging us. And it's worth taking a step back from it, looking at it, holding it up to the light and asking, is this fear rooted in reality, or is it rooted in trauma or a story that I'm not questioning? Not just for the sake of living free from some unpleasantness, although I'm all for it. If it's unnecessary unpleasantness that doesn't serve the common good, great. Let's find a way to live free of it without just passing it on to somebody else. There's something more than that. It's to do with how do we live our lives in the knowledge that there are terrible things happening in the world? They may or may not be happening to me, and they may never happen to me. But as a person with an open mind and who has been awakened to some compassion for human beings and for the earth, how is it possible to live when you're bombarded with information about so many things that are so broken without just burying your head in the sand, becoming incredibly selfish, or being overwhelmed by fear and the need to do something about the pain in the world?
Yeah, that overwhelm is a big one. Contextually to the times that we're living in, I think this is a feeling that so many people are struggling with and they're aware of, whether it be entrepreneurs, parents who are lacking the structure and support of family environments and community, and the youth that are plugged into screens and just feeling pulled in all different directions. Overwhelm is so real. And it's interesting. It's almost more accessible than fear for so many, because
Mm.
even as you talk about referencing the dark and that being connected to race or color, I'm sensitive to, but also at the same time, it's a reflection of how out of touch we have become with our humanity and our true nature. So it's fascinating because darkness is not feared. And in fact, some of the most beautiful light can only be seen in the dark. As you referenced, I love that part of the moon lighting up the ocean. And once you turn on this artificial light, you lose it. So this notion of reclaiming our relationship with darkness and darkness not being bad. This is, I see this systemically also as death, right? Look what we do with our elderly. We've severed our connection to our elders and the story and that cycle, that story of life and death as a beautiful wave that continues on. And we can debate till the cows come home, and so can everyone, on what that looks like afterwards. I'm not as concerned in that. I'm more concerned in the idea that this is a continuous story. And even as you said, if we took away fear, it would be dangerous. Yes, obviously our lives would be threatened. We would also sever our connection, in a lot of ways we have severed our connection with our elders. The way that information and wisdom was passed down, not in a way that I'm better than you or higher than you because I hold this information, but because I came here just a little bit before on this round. And maybe on the next, it'll be different. But I have this information and I share it. And that's where it goes to, how do we share it? Story. It's that true art of storytelling. And so much of that has been co-opted, and the same divisiveness that we see in so much of the world, even just this idea of the light and dark, becomes the same. And this is a theme that carries throughout your book, where it's talking about healing that and approaching it in a loving way and entering through the heart.
I was with an 82-year-old friend this morning who is an elder of mine, and she would say it's not that she never feels anxious. She's just not afraid of the same things that particularly younger people have been told to fear. Things like what other people think of you, or how much money you have in the bank. And there are material realities that we need to take care of each other with. But she has learned over life that friendship matters more than money. And if you have meaningful friendships, then you'll never go hungry. So I think when you were talking earlier about we've lost our connection to elder, or we've lost our connection to something that had deep meaning in the past, I'm not sure that's the whole truth. I don't think you think that either. We're living at a time where we know more than any previous generation has ever known. And it gets transmitted into little devices that we carry in our pockets. And unlike any previous generation, we also publish more than anyone has ever published. We all have publishing companies on our phones. Even if you've just sent a group text message, even if you're publishing your thoughts to groups of people. This has an obvious unintended consequence in that I don't always edit my thoughts before I speak them. I don't know about you. I don't always take my thoughts to the mountaintop and meditate for days and nights on whether or not what I'm thinking is wise. And in the past, it was easier to get away with that, or it was easier for that not to have much of a consequence because I just said them to whoever was sitting next to me. Now we're publishing them all the time. And there was, at least in the past, when it comes to what we call the media, and I now think the whole world is the media. Now, anybody that has a smartphone is part of the media. In the past, there was at least an ostensible guardrail in the form of editorial policies and a sense of, I guess you could call it decorum.
This episode is brought to you by Zero Shoes, barefoot-inspired minimalist shoes with a natural fit and feel that supports natural motion. All right, guys, so I've dealt with knee pains and foot issues pretty much my whole life. I could never run more than a mile because of it. I always just wrote it off and said, all right, I'm just a sprinter. But the reality was there were underlying issues. And I was using things like orthotics. When I went to the doctors, they brought up surgery as an option, which I knew was ludicrous. So I tried a bunch of different things. I did physical therapy. I worked through building up my arches with yoga. And while some of these things helped, nothing allowed me to run. Until about a year and a half ago, where I listened to a buddy of mine who always wore barefoot shoes, and I tried a pair of Zero shoes. These are zero drop shoes, which means the sole is much thinner and it allows you to have much more flexibility and contact with the earth, but also they have a wide toe box, which allow your feet to open back up into their natural form. What we don't realize is with traditional shoes, we're binding our feet to the point where after a year and a half, I can't wear any of my old shoes because when I do, my feet are so bound and blistered. Since switching to Zeros, I'm running 2 to 5 miles comfortably about 3 to 4 times a week. So I definitely want to share it with you guys. Check out Zero Shoes. Huge fan.
But if you go back and question what that decorum actually meant, in practice, it still meant only certain kinds of people ever got access to the microphone. Only certain kinds of ideas would be allowed to be. I can think of documentary footage I've seen of a TV in the early 60s with one of the first, call it gay rights organization, but it didn't call itself that then. And one of the spokespeople of this organization in the US was calling for very moderate version of equal rights for gay people. And he said, of course, we don't want to be married or anything like that. That would be going too far, right? He had to say that then to be allowed to be in a mainstream news program.
Yeah.
And he also probably believed that it was just the idea that same-sex marriage could come into existence was so inconceivable. Why would you even call for it then? So there's one example. Another example that's for I don't want to compare the gravity of them. The way war has been talked about in mainstream news media tended to be, if our country is fighting it, then we support it. And it has been very difficult for meaningful questioning of the roots of war, the treatment of people who go off to war, the impact of war on the countries where the war happens, and not to mention the kinds of things we can do to prevent more wars taking place in the future. So when I talk about decorum in the past, I'm fine with that decorum being shattered in favor of the possibility of better wisdom coming to the fore. I just think we're living in a moment where the pendulum's swinging all over the place. We're getting bombarded with information, more information than ever before, but some of that information is good information. And maybe a little part of that information is wisdom. And it's wisdom that would never have been published in the past. What we have to do is to learn the difference, or learn the tools that will help us learn the difference between propaganda. You got out of bed on the wrong side this morning and decided to tweet something grumpy. Factual information that has no information that has a context, and wisdom. And these things are possible to discern. And that is old knowledge. That is thousands of years old. There's no new information about how to find wisdom. It's just breathe more slowly and develop relationships with other wise people. That's all you have to do.
And there's a word in there, slowly. I think one of the biggest challenges has been the acceleration of communication. And yes, there's a lot more noise that happen when we're speaking in community. When we're seeking wisdom, it's usually a slower process. It's usually dealing with elders who are in a different stage of their life, and they have learned to slow it down. They've learned the value of stretching out time,
Yeah.
and there's a divine design in how that all works. And we are motivated and controlled by this currency of convenience, which means getting from someone liking it or sharing it and the dopamine hits and all of the hijacking of our biochemistry. And it becomes so complex. And so that's where, yeah, I think even just you saying, I was just with my mentor who's 82 years old. This intergenerational exchange is so vital. And this goes back to healing that relationship with the dark, right? That what I look at life, and my wife is always like, it's such a morbid way of looking at it, but I don't see it that way. That life is just like the seasons of the year, all of these cycles echo. And so you start in spring, and you could look at the astrological chart of Aries, where it's the birth, it all carries through. And then you go into summer, where it's that vibrant years of youth and coming into adulthood. Then you go into the autumnal, where you're appreciating the beauty, things are slowing down a little. And then you're into those winter months, and there's a natural rhythm and cycle to it. And the larger systems that we're building fail to take that into account a lot of times, and to honor people that are in different stages. And then you can even look at the introvert versus the extrovert and how these forms of communication work there. Cause I'm someone, I love small, intimate gatherings and talking one-on-one. And it's a very different thing when you're in this huge scape where it's terrifying, right? Talk about the fear that comes up for so many in public speaking, sharing publicly, and having that public humiliation. In fact, this was one of the biggest fears that I grappled with in my younger years. In my 20s, I had anxiety. Up until then, self-medicating, just smoking a lot of weed, and which certainly was not the right thing for anxiety. And, I joined Toastmasters, a public speaking group, as a way to work through that. And I was working with a business coach at the time, who was really more of a life coach. I just didn't know it at the time. And he asked me, what happens when you feel that anxiety? I was like, well, I tell it to shut off, and I push it down. I just tell it to get the hell out of here. We got stuff to do. And he brought up that notion of, what you asked it what it needs? What if you gave it what it needed and took care of it? And it was such a immediately disarming notion, where you could see the part of me that was trying to defend that stance was wanting to fight that thought. But so deep in my being, I knew, oh, wow, this was a part of me that was trying to protect me and was asking for my help, because if it didn't have its help, it was going to try to take control of the situation, and it wasn't equipped. And so once that relationship started to be cultivated, I saw how that shifted. And as you speak in the book, it's entering through the heart, right? It's connecting with it through a place of love. And it's not that fear doesn't exist and doesn't still continue to on different levels and on different days or situations, but the relationship evolves.
And love is not weak. And is not, weak is the right word. And I think we're in a culture where rom-com notions of love are giving way to deeper forms of how we talk about love. It seems easier for people who consider themselves to be guys. It seems easier for guys to tell each other they love each other these days than it was when I was a kid.
Sure.
I think that's a really important thing. I think it would be even better if we could evolve our public definition of love to be something like, and this is not my definition, this comes from other places. Love is extending yourself for the benefit of others. When we say I love you, we often mean you make me feel good. And that's fine. I like to feel good around my friends. I like to feel affirmed and so on. But there's a deeper definition here, which is extend for the sake of others or the sake of the good. And when we're in relationship with other people committed to the same thing, it's not martyrdom or empty self-sacrifice in the sense that I love you and you love me, or I love you and somebody else loves me, and the circle goes around and round. Now, can we get to the point where we preemptively love everybody? Yes, I think we can. I don't think I'm there. I think I'm intrigued by the principle, and I'd like to commit to the principle and devote the rest of my life how to love and be loved. If I was able to do it perfectly now, then what would be the point in trying to grow? There'd be no reason to grow.
Yeah.
But I certainly I want to commit to beginning from the place that I won't consciously do harm to anybody, and to move beyond that into wondering, what's the story going on in the life of this other person who might be irritating me or I might be feeling threatened by? At the same time, always at pains to say this, having grown up where I grew up in the north of Ireland, I don't advocate to people to put themselves in harm's way or to stay in harm's way and you can get out of harm's way. Having said that, a lot of people can't get out of harm's way. There isn't an option. And so those of us who have the privilege of being able should be using all the resources we have to help all the people in all the situations that we can. And at the same time, recognizing that life is to be lived, and everybody has a part to play in supporting other people and in naming their own needs. And the needs that are facing our society, our generation at this moment, are different to the ones that people faced 100 years ago. There are no suffragettes in Britain and Ireland anymore because the suffragettes won 100 years ago. They succeeded. So there isn't a need for suffragettes anymore. And 100 years before the suffragettes were needed, but other stuff was happening and the groundwork was being laid.
Yeah.
And
the time
I
wasn't ready yet, just the same way, right? Gay marriage couldn't have happened then.
We can say that it should have happened then and it should have always happened, but you're right. There are times and seasons when things come into view. What would be wonderful would be if more people started to ask themselves, what are the things that haven't come into view yet that should? And how should we be laying groundwork for others that come after us? I want to go back to something you were saying about elders and intergenerational. Intergenerational goes in two directions, or actually multiple directions, but let's just take old and young. And if it needs to be said out loud, it should go without saying, young people are not the problem.
The container, not the contents.
That's true. And there are, an aging generation of voters who are cranky and behaving in a selfish way and saying, I can't understand what's happening to my country. Things weren't like that when I was young. And to which I would say, actually, things were like that when you were young, and you were probably fighting for those things when you were young. And this is simply it's the way human progress happens, is creative ideas find their time, they explode into the public consciousness, and the pendulum swings one direction, and we figure out, after a period of time, we discern what is the kernel of truth, what is the core of this here that we want to hold on to. And at the same time, young people have often been in the vanguard, in the forefront of social movements, but the wisdom of those movements often came from older people, often came from more experienced people. You might be on the front line as a younger person, but it was someone a generation or two older who designed the strategy for it. And it's so much better if we're all in conversation with each other and we're all asking ourselves, what would amplify more of this love thing in our society? And again, love not being a Hallmark greeting card. Leonard Cohen has this beautiful line that love is not a victory march. Mm-hmm. And actually, love won't protect you from harm. And love will open you to more pain. Love will open you to more grief. And doing the loving thing might actually get you killed in very rare circumstances.
But it also,
and we shouldn't,
the power of death, because you're in service to something higher.
Let's say it can. I take great comfort from Ram Dass. Actually died. He did. I believe he had a medical incident where his heart stopped maybe in an emergency room, and he did die for a little while and came back. And he said something about, with a twinkle in his eye, that he didn't really feel much like Ram. He did feel scared. He did feel all the things that he had taught people we shouldn't feel. And in that sense, I think he's just being human. We're going to struggle with stuff throughout our lives. The question is, can we make the life bigger than the struggle? Can we make the life bigger than the struggle? And part of the struggle is to get rid of the idea that I have to be perfect, or that there are some things. I'm going to be 50 next year, and I'm kind of noticing there's some things I still have in me that I had when I was 10 years old. And some of them are really good enthusiasms and passions and commitments. And some of them are things I'd like to get rid of, so particularly some fears or some sense of feeling small when I or intimidated in situations that are not objectively intimidating. And I know this to be true because not everybody is intimidated by them. It's just, but it's not me on my own. It's a personality thing where it's to do with the particular journey that my life has been on. And I'm learning tender and gracious with myself about such things and try to ask, okay, where is it worth really trying to grow? And where am I just beating myself up for being who I am?
And being human. That's
Mhm.
the other thing I always go back to on the spiritual level. I believe our spirit has incarnated into this body as a vehicle or an instrument to evolve the soul in specific ways. And
Mm.
to ask it to do something that the human isn't designed to do, it's a waste of time. There's things that come along with it. And the complexity of emotions and ability to connect them, create and express ourselves is also powerful and worthy pursuits. And
Mhm.
beauty, which I want to get into a little bit later, because I also feel that there's such an importance of going back there. But we're human. You said it perfectly. It's not about that I'm never going to cause harm for the rest of my life. It's just that you're almost making a pledge that my intention is to not cause harm.
And I'm open to feedback and to accountability and to making amends. So much of the way we talk about stuff in public is it's this way or it's that way. And if you're on one side of the issue, you're basically dehumanized and you're not allowed to be at the table. And if you're on the other side, you're absolutely perfect. And sometimes the public conversation can sound like that. And really, there isn't a public conversation about national level electoral politics. What there is competing monologues. There's not a modeling of dialogue between people who are on different sides of a political issue.
Brute force training is my go-to for high-quality, durable workout gear. From sandbags and sandbells to rucksacks and weighted vests, these guys are consistently innovating and improving to make their gear work even better. They're vet-owned, so they know a thing or two about being battle-tested. Crafted in the USA to withstand the most grueling workouts, I grab the sandbag when I go on family walks, or I use it in high-intensity interval training to get a killer full-body workout while only needing one piece of gear. I also travel with my sandbag. I just empty it out, folds up, and then when I get there, I fill it up and I'm good to go. Brute force is doing a lot of work around unstable load training, which when combined with breath work and a mindful practice, it supports healthy regulation of your central nervous system. In normal speak, that means you're able to be more effectively navigating the challenges that life throws at you. Check out their full line of gear at bruteforcetraining.com/growth to get 10% off.
And I think that we can do it a lot more than we think we can. We can do it at the grocery store at the checkout, whether we're purchasing or staffing the checkout. If we're partially sighted or blind, there are still ways to show connection.
You
And,
actually the example that I usually use. There's two of them.
Mhm.
One is like when my wife and I will these games, like if you're walking on the streets of Manhattan, just trying to get someone, forget about getting someone to say hi. You'd go to a New England town and people would all say hi to each other. They'd
Yeah.
wow,
Yeah.
could we bring that back to New York? And so in New York, you have to get someone to give contact, even if it's just a glint where they're like terrified that someone saw them. But in the same way, going into a grocery store where so many of the people at the register are just not appreciated at all, and they're minimum wage.
They're on their longer than you should be.
Yes.
And they may or may not be treated well by their employers.
Yeah. And so the game of like, all right, can I make them smile? And just as a way of creating a connection in that moment.
Sure.
And
so even just whether are you doing? Are you near the end of your shift? I appreciate you. And that people might say that the old story that's become a cliche about the thousands of starfish on the beach, and there's a child who's throwing one starfish back into the water, comes along and says, it's not making any difference. Look at all these thousands of starfish that are drowning in the air. And the kid picks up another starfish and throws it back into the water and says, it made a difference to that one. So that story's become a cliche. I actually think it's a well-intentioned, but potentially there is never only one person throwing the starfish back into the sea. You may only throw one starfish back into the sea in your lifetime, but there are innumerable other people, each of them looking after one starfish at a time. And when I think about the north of Ireland, there were horrifying things that happened in our society. Tremendous grief and terror that affected many hundreds of thousands of people, my family included. And I don't diminish those stories or do anything that doubles the harm to the people, doubles the pain that people have experienced. So I'm holding that tenderly as a person who has experienced some of that pain myself. And at the same time, we will never know how much more suffering was avoided by people who did the right thing once. One person doing the right thing once, and another one person doing the right thing once, and another person doing the right thing once. There's always more than one person doing it. And we all have the opportunity every single day to do what we know is right. Because unless we were, I'm not quite sure how to put this, the typical education of a child, unless there's deep abuse going on, the typical family, whatever their politics might be, they will agree on about 5 things that all children should know. One is share your food. Another is don't hit her. Another is don't steal. Another is you've got to understand he's having a hard time at home and that's why he behaves that way. I heard all 4 of those things from parents as a child because the playground is like a rehearsal for the big so place where archetypal myths that have been with us for tens of thousands of years get played out. Share, don't hit, don't steal, be compassionate. Basically, try to understand why the other person might be doing what they're doing. And there's enough to go round, right? Children who are raised in generally sane households are told. But something happens as we age where we stop believing those things. And we don't say share, we say keep everything you can. And if you can get away with stealing it, great. And hit them before they hit you. And I don't care what their story is. The only thing that matters is that they cut me off in traffic. I mean, because I've seen so much of this and because I'm as grumpy, as crotchety as the next person, as prone to not understand other people as anyone else. I just happen to have been mentored by people who are wiser than I am and who are more mature than I am. And sometimes I hear their voice in my head. I remember one time being in a traffic accident in Belfast, not a very serious one. A man drove into the car and I got out of the car and it was dark and raining and he got out of his car and he was an elderly gentleman and he was crying because he was in shock. And I think he was ashamed of what he had done. And I don't think I would have been angry with him anyway. But his tears showed me like that I make a mistake. I want someone to respond to me knowing that on the inside, I'm probably crying. On the inside, I'm probably feeling terrible about what I did. And I don't need more judgment and more criticism. As long as I'm facing up to the impact of what I've done and I'm acting with integrity, you can be gracious to me. And then we can sort this out together. And I actually remember, this is not a story of me being a hero. All I did was I wasn't nasty to an old man who was crying. That's the minimum you should expect from anybody. But I remember reaching out and touching him on his arm just to reassure him and tell him, it's all right. It's all right. And as I remember that story, I think that was a privilege for me to be able to have that encounter with this stranger. I hope that it made his night slightly easier. It was certainly worth the cost of whatever I had to pay to fix my car, to have the honor of being able to comfort a vulnerable person in their moment of frailty. And I've certainly had that done to me many times.
And you may have rewritten a story that you were holding. I'm not saying that you did or didn't, but those are opportunities.
I do go to the kind of grunt, first of all, and then I try to remember, I'm like, Gareth, have you never done that? Have you never had a reason to do that? Have you never thought, I wish people would just understand I have needs too? What saddens me so much about the way tribalism in our society is manifesting is we could live in a world where your group manifests its gifts for the sake of the common good, and we all get to benefit from it. And my group manifests our gifts for the common good, and we all get to benefit from it. There's an idea, a lovely idea, that in the future we won't have wars between nations anymore, but we will have large scale cooperative competitions. So it might be like Italy and Iran compete with each other to see who can cure cancer first. And because competition does seem to be built into human nature, but wouldn't it be actually worth something?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if those of us who have more of a sense of what economic equality could look like, if we could find ways to show what a world of greater equality is like for everybody, even the people who feel like they would have to give something up to get that. And then those of us who believe in, let's call them the values of small towns, right? To discern the difference between community and reactionary conservative puritanical moral views. People really, when it comes down to it, who you're in love with is not a threat to community. It's whether or not the place you live in has people who don't look each other in the eye and smile. There are ways we could manifest the gifts of our tribe that serve the needs of everyone, instead of holding on for dear life to this one thing that we think matters to us more than anything else. And we will hurt other people in order to keep this. You don't even have to believe thickly advocate against it. All you have to do is to look at what has happened when people have tried to have one tribe defeat another. It just doesn't work. So enlightened self-interest would say we have to find a way to move beyond tribalism into mutual interdependence. And the best way to do that is to not tell this other side, you're evil. Judge the impacts of their beliefs for sure. Show them the impacts of their beliefs for sure. And don't be naive, because some people haven't woken up to this yet, and they will not pay attention to dialogue until they're ready to do so. I am absolutely certain that vast number of people in this society are persuadable to join a common good oriented political movement, but they haven't joined it because they haven't been invited. And worse than that, they've been told that they are evil because of the political positions that they hold sincerely, perhaps because they've always felt that they were part of this movement, and they've never felt spoken to respectfully by another. And yes, I know there will be people listening who say, what about? There is always a what about. And I am not advocating that people in harm's way stay there. And I am not advocating that people put themselves in harm's way in order to have political dialogue with someone who might hurt them. Paradoxically, a lot of the people who promoted the dialogues in Northern Irish society harm's way, or they were people who had suffered greatly. You don't have to be that person to do the dialogue. As a person identified with the LGBTQ plus community, sometimes what I want is for straight people to go and do the dialogue. That's what I want, because I'm tired of the dialogue. And sometimes it does have a greater cost for me as a queer person to be in dialogue with someone who might be persuadable to change their views so that they lobby for policies that make the lives of queer people easier. A lot of the time I want a straight person to speak. But as a white person, I am asking myself, what's my role regarding questions of people who have been oppressed and targeted as a result of racism and ethnic prejudice? Whether you think you earned what you have, or you inherited it, or you stole it, you have it, so you should use it for the common good. And then ask yourself what you need and who are the safe people who you can ask to support you with that. It really isn't rocket science.
You brought up earlier the idea of asking yourself what ideas times have come. And this brings me to the writer Stephen B. Johnson in his book, The History of Innovation. He speaks of the concept of the adjacent possible, which tells us that through the history of innovation, you want to find that sweet spot of how far you can push and innovate that can still be accepted and adopted by the people that it's being presented to. If you go too far
Mhm.
out, you get strung up and it's heresy, and you could come out of it alive. Oftentimes it didn't. And so it's tricky because we could sit there and say, this is the challenge of the seers, right? The ones who see
Mhm.
what they feel should be and feeling it should be right now versus, okay, how can I help that begin to unfold? And that's where meeting someone where they are, I think, in the story. And you also bring up this concept of in the book of when you're in the story, you don't know what the beginning or the end is. And a
Mhm.
lot of times we're in this paradox, especially as humans, where we look at our finite, seemingly, it's an illusion, but this seemingly finite period of time we're here and what needs to get accomplished in that time.
Mhm.
I guess this also goes to the notion of the idea of so much of this work. And I believe the most important work we do as humans, and I'll say even more so for men in the role of the sacred masculine, it oftentimes is thankless because at best it goes unnoticed. Like you're talking about doing the good act that we'll never be able to measure the repercussions of the positive impact. And that's where if we can't cultivate within ourselves the connection to and the wisdom of knowing that the impact is happening and it has happened and that's enough, that's what allows us to start looking to other people and seeing their role. So when the young kid is on the field doing a lot of the physical work, but it's the strategy of the elder who put it in place, they're all of a sudden able to connect the two and see, okay, I
Mhm.
have this role in it, but I also, again, I see you. And you could be seen for the role and none is above or below each other.
I had a thought about it a minute ago, but it's gone.
I rambled on too long.
No, 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 no. It's all interesting stuff.
You also talk about a lot of the illusions that exist in our world and finances and money
Mhm.
being a big one that governs a lot of people's lives and the fear of that around scarcity or competition with being where other people are of the age. Can you talk more about that one?
Yeah, yeah. And I want to take care in how I talk about that. I'm not talking about the sort of thing about we can manifest all the money in the world. And I've been around kind of Christian prosperity teachers who are mistaken. Let's just be generous and say they are mistaken. And there's some pretty disgraceful stuff that goes on in many religious traditions and in politics too, where there are small numbers of people getting rich off the back of people who are suffering and being told we're going to make you rich if you give us. And at one level, that's just another version of bread and circus. It's been with us forever. I just want a higher quality bread, a more meaningful circus to happen, and a bit more social equality and economic equality between the people who are running the circuses and the people who are paying to attend them. The question about how money is distributed in our society, that's a question of economic justice and a structural reality, which refers to the stuff you were talking about with Stephen Johnson's idea about how change happens at a structural level. And there are some people, that's their job. That's what they're called to. They're called to be involved in the incremental shifts and the sometimes great leaps forward that happen at a structural level. Some people are called to be the prophets who say, it's not good enough. It's not good enough. And this has to stop now. And woe to you if you don't stop it. And this thing has to change overnight. And woe to you if we don't change it overnight. There are some people that is their calling. And there are some people who are the visionaries, who are the ones who can see what's over the next hill and can maybe say, I'm not going to get there with you, but this is where we're going to move toward as we travel together on this journey toward an evolution of a greater sense of love for each other.
And they create the
And
possibility of that coming into existence.
yeah, if you don't speak a vision, there is a teaching that says where there is no vision, then the people perish. And the problem is sometimes where there is a vision, they perish anyway because the vision's a selfish vision or a bad vision. If we don't say, I can see what's possible, then it might happen by accident, but it probably won't. It probably won't. And somebody asked me on a radio show in Belfast last year when I was advocating for reconciliation, what I was talking about earlier in this conversation, the stages of reconciliation being the person who created the harm, acknowledging that they did it, making a commitment that they won't do it again, seeking in a sensitive way to discover if the person they harmed is open or would be willing to some kind of interaction. If that person isn't willing, then they don't keep trying to talk to the person they've harmed. They just try to live reconciliation and live amends to other people in ways that won't create more harm. But if the person is open to the dialogue, then the conversation should go something like, I'll use a terribly mundane example. Brian, I realize I stood on your toe last week and I was rude to you at the time and I discounted your pain. Would you like to tell me about that? And you might say, yeah, I actually had a broken toe that was just healing and you've meant it's going to take another 2 months before I heal. And it reminded me of a painful time when I was 6 years old when the school bully stamped on my foot. And I might say, I would then repeat that story to you. Do your story? And you might say yes. And then I might say, look, what can I do? And you might say, I don't know, there's some nonprofit that provides shoes to people with problem feet or who can't afford shoes. And if you could make a donation to do that, that's a beautiful thing. And I was talking about these stages of reconciliation in the context of Ireland and the far more harm than just stepping on people's toe. And the radio host said, but what if the person who created the harm doesn't want to participate? And I said, that would be very sad. Because not only would the survivor of the harm not have the opportunity for these amends to be made, but the person who caused the harm is going to continue to live in hell in this part of their life to the degree that they caused harm to somebody else. They're going to suffer within themselves, even if they don't know it, because they will be out of touch with their humanity. And the host, who's a friend of mine, he was being devil's advocate. It was almost as if the feeling was, because some people will not participate in these processes, then we shouldn't even talk about having them. Or it's not politically realistic that large numbers of people who were involved in the Northern Ireland Troubles will do that. To which I would say, political realism isn't the same. It does not equate to what the sacred ethical duty of human beings to each other is. And secondly, there are plenty of things that people in the past thought weren't politically realistic, and they have now become second nature. They may not happen in my lifetime, but they certainly won't happen if we just don't talk about them, if we don't articulate the vision. And again, some of us, it's our role to be the visionary and not be involved in the strategic change. I'm glad I'm not a structural strategic change person, because that would frustrate and exhaust me, and I'm not that good at it. And there are people who are wonderful at it. I'm more of the kind of vision person. And it's because I've been around visionary people, and I think I woke up to politically induced pain, let's put it that way, because I experienced so much of it and was on the fringes of so much of it when I was growing up. And now I live in a society in the US where politically induced pain is being championed as the way we get things done. And that has to change. We need to articulate a vision of holding boundaries around harm and saying, no, this policy will cause harm and we will oppose this policy, but also refusing to dehumanize our political opponents. And beyond that, always opening a door toward what's persuadable. Where is the common ground? And yeah, who's in the room will be determined by who has committed to not do any harm. I've felt for a while, having grown up in a religious tradition that was very exclusive. You had to believe certain things to be allowed to be saved and to be allowed to go to heaven when you die. And there's loads of religious traditions that have versions of that idea. Now I believe everybody's invited. Everybody's invited. You can all come into the room. The only rule is you have to commit that you're not going to harm anybody else while you're there. And if you can't make that commitment, then you can't come into the room. You need to sit outside the room. But I'm not going to call you demonic. I'm not going to say that you're evil. And some of us will go out and visit you and periodically say, hey, have you changed your mind yet? Because you are welcome to come. You're still welcome to come back in. All you have to do is agree not to harm anybody else here. We can disagree about everything else. And I'm still going to work for a more equal society. I'm still going to work for a society in which the evolution of love is the watchword and the thing that we most push for. You can come with us, but we're not going to let you stop us.
Yeah, there's healthy boundaries, but also the invitation. And my aunt, who's a big history buff, she says that the time where this country went awry politically is where the Democrats and Republicans stopped having a communal dining hall.
Yep.
And this simple notion that when we're in the same room together and we're in conversation and in a human way, especially in that primal way, breaking bread together, we drop our guard, we drop the narrative. That openness, again, I think is really the price of admission. If we're not open, we're not going to cause harm. But secondly, that we're open to at least listening. Even if really we're steadfast, I'm not going to change my position. Can I at least just listen? And we lost that in a lot of our forums. You had a quote that you brought up in the book. When you build relationships on othering, you learn more about that than love.
Yeah. It's transactional. And the idea of national level politicians now, there was a strategy behind that. There were some people in leadership in political parties who, as far as I know, what I've read is they actively, consciously decided, let's send them home at weekends. And the lack of campaign finance reform is part of the heart of this as well, because basically Congress people and senators have to go home at weekends so they can raise money. Whereas in the past, they used to stay in DC during the time that that Congress was in session, and they had to hang out with each other. And if I was a Machiavellian political leader and I wanted to make sure that Divide and Conquer ruled the day, I would discourage social relationships between people of opposing political views. Now, again, I don't think that people of opposing political views just talking to each other is the magic bullet, or that it's always the best thing to do, because sometimes what can happen if we're in a relationship, I can persuade you that the harm I'm doing really doesn't matter that much. And you might actually be more of a pushover, and you might be less likely to oppose me in a vote because, well, he's a good guy, but behind the scenes, he couldn't possibly mean this. So we have to be discerning about that. But those are more rare circumstances than I think our public discourse leaves us believing right now. And I'm much more interested. My great teacher in all of this is a Franciscan priest called Richard Rohr, who teaches that the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better, because oppositional energy always recreates itself. Now, there are times when we need to be oppositional. There are times when we need to stand in front of someone to protect them. There are times when we need to stand up and say no. Those times exist. The problem is we've made them into a way of life. We've made oppositionalism into the way things are. And it doesn't work. What is far more effective is to articulate and embody what is the better thing that we want to see happen. And the better thing that I want to see happen is, frankly, more sharing so that everyone has what they need. Another beautiful piece of ancient Middle Eastern poetry speaks of everyone living beneath their own vine and fig tree in peace and unafraid. And it's this image of we're not all living on top of each other. It's like we're in this beautiful valley and I have a vine and a fig tree. I'm not even sure what a vine and a fig tree are. I guess fig trees produce figs and vines produce grapes. So wine and figs, I guess, is all you need, or sparkling water and figs is all you need. And I can see you at a distance under yours, and we just wave at each other. I'm safe, you're safe, we're in peace and unafraid. And then we gather together when we want to gather together. And then every now and again we see, oh, wow, there's someone, their vine has died this year. We've got enough to go round. Again, it's not rocket science. It is a lot simpler than people make it into.
And that's a city in such a complex time and world.
Johnson wrote, it was called Everything Bad is Good for You. Did you read that book? That was, I remember one of the things he said was that the average episode of Cagney and Lacey, the cop show in the 80s, had the two main characters. Crime would be committed at the start of the episode and it would be solved at the end of the episode. And over the course of an entire season, you might learn a couple more things about Cagney and Lacey and their husbands. And then he compared that with the average episode of 24, a show that I think had horrendous impacts on the world because it effectively advocated for torture and was very much in tune with the saber rattling of the immediate post 9/11 era, until I read Everything Bad is Good for You and realized that it was teaching complexity as well, because there was something like 19 main characters in the average season of 24, and you got to learn about all of them, and they were all relating to each other at different angles and different levels. And frankly, this might sound silly, but you saw men cry in 24. You saw the trauma of war. You saw the pain of Jack Bauer. Jack Bauer wasn't Rambo. Rambo was this absolutely invincible character, at least in the way people remember him. He's a lot more vulnerable in the first film than he is in the subsequent ones, where he becomes like a machine. And Jack Bauer, yeah, I still think 24 had an insidious influence on the way people think about torture, but it also taught people complexity of relationship and storytelling, and that warriors are vulnerable too. It will be better someday when an entire season is devoted to the recovery of a wounded warrior from PTSD, or to someone deciding to take less violent action or to intervene unethical violent action. And some of those shows and movies are around. We give more oxygen to applaud them and pay to watch them, because then more of them will get made.
We're coming up on our time, but I'd love for you to touch on another important topic in the book that I think segues from where you are, and the idea of using shelter of story.
Yeah. So we all know that we need food, water, air, and shelter. And I think most of us define shelter as 4 walls and a roof if we live in Western culture. But I think shelter is more than the sleep or where we live. I think the stories we tell and believe about ourselves are shelters, and some of them have really leaky roofs or creaky floorboards, or one of the walls is missing, or we're living in a shelter that doesn't belong to us, that isn't fit for purpose. And so this is one of the reasons why I think breathing more slowly and being in conversation with a handful of people who are committed to a conscious journey of discovering wisdom will help us get clear about the stories we're telling. You got to breathe more slowly to just slow down enough to ask, what stories do I believe about myself? And then to ask, are these stories true? And if they're not true, what's a more true version of the story? And are these stories helpful? And if they're not helpful, what's a more helpful version? And you can't figure that out for yourself by yourself alone. You need to do part of it on your own, and you need to do part of it in community. And we can do all kinds of, I call them mini autobiographies. You could do an autobiography about your relationship with money. Where do you first remember thinking about money? What did your family teach you about money? Where do you feel fear about money? And then you could do one about your name. What does the name Brian mean to you? What does it mean to you that it's spelled with a Y? Has that left you feeling like you're left out because most Brians spell it with an I? Or does it make you feel special because you're different? And what have you been told by your family about where that name came from? What about the other famous Bryans? And then you could do a little autobiography about your town, the town you grew up in, and what it meant to you. And then step back from it and ask, are these stories true? And what would be a more true version? And are these stories helpful? And then ask questions about ambition and what you want from your life and why you decided to want those things. Where did you first start wanting those things? By wanting these things, what are the things you don't want? How do you measure yourself against other people? Why do you measure yourself against other people? Do you know anybody who is happy who constantly measures themselves against other people? Now, we can have mirrors. We can, as I do, mentors who I look at and say, like them, and they're helping me. The same thing as envy or rivalry with someone who I want to be as successful as they are, or I want to outdo them, or worse, I want them to fail.
And even if it's not saying I want to be everything about this person. It might just be on one area.
Exactly. And so to sit with whatever age or time of life you're at, a lovely exercise, and it's in the book, that was taught to me by some really good people to imagine yourself at a ripe old age, feels really wise to you, sitting on a chair, looking at you in the place you're in now, and then hearing that wise version of you from the future say to you, Brian, or say to you, Gareth, these are the things you should let go of, and these are the things you should pursue. And then you say back, but I have these obstacles in my way, to which the wiser version of you will say, this is what you're supposed to do with those obstacles. And I say it in a kind of a blasé way now, you know, you don't do it in 10 seconds. This takes a little bit of practice. But at the same time, I want to say the most profound and thoroughgoing spiritual practices often are the simplest ones. The Dalai Lama was once asked, what's one thing that Americans can do to make the world better? And he said, go to sleep when it gets dark and wake up when it gets light. And he meant that literally, but he also meant, what could that also mean metaphorically? What could it mean to go to sleep when it gets dark, when it's time to go to sleep? And what does it mean when it's time to be awake, then be awake? Because there is a time for everything. And we're living in a time where there's like a collision, and it feels like everything's happening at once.
There's a discord to a lot of it too. When you're in rhythm with the rise and fall of the sun and the moon, we're back to our true nature, which is knowing that we are one.
We are one, yeah. Yeah. And to give yourself over to love doesn't mean you're not going to suffer anymore. It might actually call you into places where you will experience some more pain, or you might need to be in solidarity with people who are being targeted. And that's okay, actually. For most of us, that's not what's going to happen. For most of us, we're just going to learn what matters more in life and be ready to put ourselves where someone like you or someone like me needs to be at a time when we are necessary in that moment for the protection of the vulnerable, whether it's vulnerable people or a vulnerable planet. But you can go so far down that road that you make this, again, this mythical, dramatic narrative out of your life that can sometimes serve and can sometimes just be about ego. So for now, like what I want, as I know we're drawing this conversation to an end, is to just, I'm looking at you, you're looking at me. We've never met in person, but this conversation to me is clearly evidence that we are one. And I want the best for you and you want the best for me. And we are smiling at each other. And I hope people listening might get a bit of a smile as well. Your life is fucking difficult a lot of the time. And it is fucking beautiful. And if I've got something you need, I'd like to share it with you and to be able to ask you to share with me the thing that I need. Who knows how long we're here for? We don't have to go. Someone said to me once, you don't have to go looking for suffering, but when it comes your way, for God's sake, don't waste it. Learn from it, go through it, ask for help. It may kill you. I'd like to be there to help you if I can. And then we move to the next thing.
Gareth Higgins, the book is How Not to Be Afraid. Thanks so much for joining on the show.
My pleasure, Brian. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us this week on Growth Guide. A big thanks to our sponsors, Atmananda Yoga. You guys have got to check out their yoga alignment mat. I've been using this for a long time. As you know by now, I've studied and trained with them as a yoga teacher, and the mat is incredible to deepen your practice and to ensure a lifelong injury-free practice. Visit growthguide.love/alignment for more info or to buy. Be sure to use code GROWTH at checkout for 15% off. One of the perks of hosting your own podcast is that you could sponsor your own brand. On that note, this episode is sponsored by Spirit Squad. You tired of your Matrix standard issued uniform? Have you pulled the thread and need some new ones? This calls for some 5D level ascension gear, such as our 432Hz classic hoodie and our Resist the Program Third Eye Kitty tee. Spirit Squad's got you covered. From ceremony gear to pre-ceremony gear to post-ceremony gear, we have anti-ceremony gear too. Are you raising consciousness while little ones are raising hell? We have the perfect gear for drop-off, pickup, and serving in the 3-foot kingdom. While you're at it, Spirit Squad has mini sizes, like our Feral Child shirt, strong enough for your little, yet sends a message to the fearful and weak. Give this one some space. Grab your Spirit Squad gear now at spiritsquadsupply.com, and welcome to the rebellion. Make sure to visit our website, growthguide.love, where you can find freebies, exclusive content, and subscribe to the show so you'll never miss an episode. If you found value in listening, I'd really appreciate a rating on iTunes. I can't tell you just how important this is. Or spread the love. Tell your friends, your fam, heck, tell your spirit animals. And follow me on Instagram at growthguide.love.